The cold bit through everything. It didn't matter how many layers Private First Class Mary Raglan wrapped around her body, the field jacket over the fatigues, the wool socks doubled inside her boots, the gloves that never seemed thick enough. The February chill of Birmingham, England, found its way to her bones anyway. She stood in the cavernous warehouse, her breath forming small clouds in the darkness, and stared at what they'd come here to face. Mountains of mail. Not stacks, not piles. Mountains. Letters and packages rose from the concrete floor to the rafters, 30 feet high in some places. A landscape of paper and cardboard that stretched into the shadows. The windows had been painted black for the wartime blackout, so even in daylight they worked in perpetual dusk. Somewhere in the darkness she could hear the skittering of rats, drawn by the rotting food in packages that had been sitting here for months, some for years. Fruitcakes from Christmases past, cookies that had turned to dust, fried chicken wrapped in wax paper, now home to colonies of mold. "Lord have mercy," whispered the woman beside her, and Mary couldn't tell if it was a prayer or just the only words that made sense. Major Charity Adams stood at the front of the formation, her spine rigid, her uniform immaculate, despite the transatlantic crossing that had nearly killed them all. She was 26 years old and carried herself like she'd been born for this moment. Born to lead this battalion of 855 black women into a war zone where nobody wanted them, into a mission everyone said they'd fail. She looked at the mountains of undelivered mail, at the assignment the U.S. Army had given them with barely concealed contempt, and Mary saw something flicker across her commander's face. Not fear, never fear. Something else. Determination, maybe. Or fury held on a very tight leash. "They told us 6 months," Major Adams said, her voice carrying through the warehouse. "They told us it would take 6 months to sort through this mess, to get these letters and packages to our boys fighting across Europe. 6 months." She turned to face her battalion, these women who'd survived everything the military had thrown at them just to get here. "We're going to do it in 3. The crossing had been hell." Mary closed her eyes and she could still feel the deck of the SS Isle de France tilting beneath her feet. The sudden violent turn that sent pots and pans crashing in the galley, the whispered terror running through the troops. U-boats. German submarines in the water, close enough to kill them all. For 11 days they'd sailed through the Atlantic in February, through storms and ice and the constant threat of torpedoes punching through the hull. Mary Raglan, who'd grown up in North Carolina where the biggest body of water she'd known was the creek behind her grandmother's house, had been so scared she could barely breathe. "Darn tootin', I got scared," she'll say later, when enough time had passed to make it sound like something other than absolute terror, especially when you can't see land all around. And then, hours after they finally reached Glasgow, Scotland, as they stood on solid ground for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the air raid siren had split the night. The sound was like nothing Mary had ever heard, a wail that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Move! Move!" the officers shouted, and 800 women ran across the frozen, snow-covered ground, their boots slipping on ice, their lungs burning from the cold and the fear. Somewhere in the darkness, a V-1 rocket, the Germans called them Vergeltungswaffe, vengeance weapons, but the British soldiers had a different name, buzz bombs, for the terrible sound they made before the engine cut out and they fell screaming toward the earth was hunting for targets. They dove into shelters and held their breath and waited for the explosion that would tell them whether they'd live or die. Welcome to the war. Now, standing in the Birmingham warehouse, Mary understood that the war they'd come to fight would be different from the one the men were fighting in France and Germany. They wouldn't carry rifles. They wouldn't storm beaches or take hills. But the enemy was just as real, just as determined to see them fail. The mail was only the beginning. Charity Adams had known from the moment she raised her right hand and took the oath at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, back in July 1942, that she was stepping into a battle with no clear front lines. She'd been a mathematics teacher in Columbia, South Carolina, studying part-time for her master's degree in psychology at Ohio State, when the invitation came to apply for the first officer training class of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. Her father was a Methodist minister, her mother a school teacher, and they'd raised her to believe that education and excellence were the only weapons a black person had in Jim Crow America. She graduated valedictorian from Booker T. Washington High School, earned her degree in math and physics from Wilberforce University. And now at 23, she'd become one of the first black women ever commissioned as an officer in the United States military. But commissioned into what? A segregated unit in a segregated army in a nation that couldn't decide if black women were citizens or property. At Fort Des Moines, the barracks were divided by race. The training was divided by race. Even the platoons she commanded were segregated, 2 white, 1 black. She watched white officers who'd scored lower than her on every test get promoted over her. She watched black enlisted women work twice as hard for half the recognition. And she learned to swallow her rage, to channel it into something useful, something that might actually change things. I survived in a state of pleasant belligerency, she'd write later, trying to put words to the tightrope walk of being a black woman in uniform. I had no chip on my shoulder. I kept it slightly below the shoulder. By 1943, she was a major, one of the highest-ranking black women in the entire military. And in December 1944, when the War Department finally caved to pressure from Mary McLeod Bethune and Eleanor Roosevelt and dozens of black organizations demanding that black women get the chance to serve overseas, Charity Adams was the obvious choice to lead them. The 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, the 6888, the only all-black, predominantly female battalion that would ever deploy to the European theater during World War II. They trained at Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, where the segregation was so thick you could choke on it. And now they were here, in Birmingham, staring at a mission that white male soldiers had already tried and failed to complete. No male, low morale, that was their motto. Because by early 1945, with the war grinding through its final, bloodiest year, with American boys dying in the snows of the Ardennes and the ruins of German cities, mail was more than just letters. Mail was proof that someone back home remembered you. Mail was your girlfriend's perfume on stationery, your mother's handwriting telling you she was proud, your kid brother's crayon drawing of you in your uniform. Mail was the thin thread connecting soldiers to the lives they'd left behind, the lives they were fighting to get back to. And 7 million American personnel scattered across Europe soldiers. Government workers, Red Cross volunteers weren't getting their mail. It sat here in these warehouses buried under the chaos of war. Some packages had been mailed 3 years ago. Some letters were addressed simply to Robert Smith, U.S. Army, and there were 7,500 Robert Smiths serving in Europe. Some mail was for men who'd been transferred 5 times since the letter was sent. Some was for men who were already dead. The U.S. Army had looked at this mountain of failure and made a calculation. Send the black women. If they succeed, problem solved. If they fail, well, what did anyone expect? Major Adams had made a different calculation. She organized her battalion into 3 shifts working around the clock. 8 hours on, 8 hours off, 7 days a week. She had them develop a card catalog system, 7 million cards that would track every single person in the European theater, updated constantly as soldiers moved, as they were wounded, as they died. She had them look for clues in vague addresses, middle names, unit numbers, hometown mentions in the letter, anything that might identify which John Smith or James Johnson this package belonged to. And she made damn sure that nobody, not one single white officer, got to tell her how to do it. Private Elaine Bennett remembered the day a general showed up 3 weeks into their deployment. He walked through the warehouse with his aides trailing behind him, his face twisted with barely concealed contempt, and he found Major Adams at her desk. "I'm going to send a white first lieutenant down here," he told her, not even bothering to lower his voice, "to show you how to run this unit." The warehouse went silent. 800 women stopped sorting, stopped moving, stopped breathing. This was the moment they'd all known was coming. The moment when the military would decide that black women, no matter how educated, no matter how capable, still needed white men to tell them what to do. Major Charity Adams stood up from her desk. She was 5'3", 120 pounds. And she looked that general in the eye like she was staring down the devil himself. "Over my dead body, sir." The general's face went red. "Are you refusing a direct order, Major?" "I'm filing a complaint, sir, about an officer using language stressing racial segregation, in direct violation of directives from Allied headquarters." For a long moment, nobody moved. The general could have her court-martialed. He could have her cashier out of the service. He had the power to destroy your career with a word. But Charity Adams didn't blink. And 800 women stood behind her, watching, waiting, ready to march straight into hell if their commander asked them to. The general left. The white lieutenant never came, and Major Adams sat back down at her desk and went back to work. Years later, after the war, that same general would seek her out. "You outsmarted me," he'd tell her, "and I am proud that I know you," but that was later. In February 1945, in the freezing warehouses of Birmingham, England, all they had was the work. Corporal Alice Dixon sorted mail until her fingers bled. The paper cuts were constant, thin slices across her fingertips that stung with every envelope she touched. The eye strain was worse, spent in dim light reading handwriting that ranged from immaculate to illegible. squinting at addresses that made no sense, trying to find patterns in chaos. They wore ski pants and field jackets over their uniforms because the warehouses had no heat. They worked with gloves on when they could, but gloves made it impossible to handle the thin paper. So mostly they just let their hands freeze. We're all human, Alice would say, decades later, when people finally started asking about what they'd done here, whether black, white, red, or brown, and we all have something to offer. But in 1945, in England, in the U.S. military, being black and female meant you had to offer twice as much to get half the credit. It meant you ate in separate dining halls from the white soldiers. It meant you slept in separate quarters. It meant that when the American Red Cross set up recreation facilities in Birmingham, they created segregated clubs, one for white soldiers, one for black soldiers. And when the black women of the 6,888th tried to enter the enlisted men's club that welcomed black male soldiers, they were turned away at the door. Major Adams led a boycott. "Over my dead body," she'd said to the general, and now she said it again to the Red Cross, to the Army Recreation Services, to anyone who thought these women would accept being treated as less than human. If the military wanted to segregate them, fine. The 6,888th would take care of itself. They opened their own recreation hall, ran their own beauty parlor, organized their own dances. They invited British locals to their parties, socialized with the citizens of Birmingham who welcomed them into their homes for Sunday dinners, who treated them with more dignity than their own country's military did. And they worked. God, how they worked. 65,000 pieces of mail per shift. That was the average, but some days they pushed it higher. They developed a rhythm, an assembly line of organized chaos. One team opened packages that had been sealed for years, checking for spoilage, for contraband, for anything that might endanger the soldiers who'd received them. Another team matched names to the card catalog, cross-referencing serial numbers and unit assignments. A third team bundled the mail by location, preparing it for transport to the front lines. And all of it happened in 3 rotating shifts that never stopped, that turned the warehouse into a machine running on the fuel of black women's labor. Private Dorothy Johnson handled the hardest job, returning mail addressed to soldiers who'd been killed in action. Every day, she processed dozens of letters and packages that would never reach their destination because the soldier was dead. She had to stamp them deceased and send them back to families who might not even know yet that their son or husband or father was gone. Sometimes the envelope was the first notice the family received. Dorothy would hold those letters in her hands and think about the mothers opening them, seeing that stamp, understanding in one terrible moment that their world had ended. She cried the first week. After that, she just got angry. Angry at the waste of it all, angry at the war that kept killing boys who'd barely lived. Angry at a world that thought these women weren't good enough to serve but was perfectly happy to give them the job of sorting through the wreckage of other people's grief. The anger kept her working. By May 1945, the impossible had happened. 3 months after arriving in Birmingham, the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion had cleared the backlog. 17 million pieces of mail sorted and delivered. A 6-month job done in half the time. The warehouse that had been a mountain of failure was now just an empty building. Its windows still painted black, its concrete floors still freezing, but clear, empty, finished. The war in Europe ended that month. On May 8th, VE Day, Germany surrendered, and across the continent, soldiers celebrated in the streets. In Birmingham, the women of the 6,888 celebrated too, but quietly because they knew the war wasn't over for them. There was more mail waiting in France. They shipped out to Rouen in June, riding through the French countryside in trucks and trains, seeing for the first time the devastation the war had left behind. Bombed-out buildings, destroyed bridges, towns that were nothing but rubble, and everywhere the French civilians who lined the roads to watch them pass. These black American women in uniform, something they'd never seen before. In Rouen, they marched in a parade honoring Joan of Arc, the French teenager who'd led armies 500 years ago and been burned at the stake for it. Major Adams led her battalion through the streets where Joan had died, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Here were women who'd been told they couldn't lead, couldn't serve, couldn't make a difference. Here were women who'd proven everyone wrong. The work in Rouen was the same as Birmingham, but harder because now they were working alongside French civilians and German prisoners of war. Because the facilities were worse, because summer in France was hot and the warehouses became ovens that baked the smell of rot into everything. And because the attention was constant, overwhelming. American soldiers, most of them white, most of them men, couldn't believe what they were seeing. Black women, in uniform, running a military operation. The stares were constant. Some soldiers were curious, some were respectful, some were hostile. And some showed up at the compound where the 6,888th was housed and tried to force their way in. Tried to harass the women until Major Edens stationed military police at the gates and ordered them to use whatever force was necessary to keep her battalion safe. The women of the 6,888th had been trained in jiu-jitsu instead of being given weapons. The military's logic was that women couldn't be trusted with guns, even in a war zone, even when they needed to defend themselves. So they learned to fight with their hands, to break holds and throw attackers, and they stood guard over their own compound because nobody else would do it for them. They cleared Rouen by October, another impossible job done ahead of schedule, and then they were transferred to Paris, to the city that had just been liberated, where suddenly everything changed. Paris treated them like heroes. They were housed in luxury hotels. They ate in fine restaurants. They walked through the streets and Parisians stopped to thank them, to shake their hands, to invite them to parties and dinners. For the first time since they'd joined the military, the women of the 6,888th were treated like soldiers who'd done something extraordinary. Not black soldiers, not female soldiers, just soldiers. Private Margaret Glensale Semmes, who'd studied music at Northwestern before the war, spent her evenings in Paris at cafes and concerts, soaking in a culture that didn't seem to care about the color of her skin. She'd grown up on Chicago's South Side, heavily involved in the Cosmopolitan Community Church, where women like Mary G. Evans and Marjorie Joyner had taught her that she could be anything she wanted. The military had tried to teach her something different, that there were limits to what a black woman could do, places she couldn't go, heights she couldn't reach. Paris told her the military was lying, but Paris was brief. By January 1946, the 6,888th was being reduced in size. 300 women were sent home, another 200 discharged. The war was over, the mission was complete, and the United States military didn't need an all-black female battalion anymore. In February 1946, the remaining members of the 6,888th boarded ships and sailed home. They arrived at Fort Dix, New Jersey, and were met with silence. No parade, no ceremony, no recognition at all. The Army simply disbanded the battalion, sent the women home, and filed the whole thing away as if it had never happened. Charity Adams, now Lieutenant Colonel Adams, the highest-ranking black woman in the U.S. military, went back to Ohio State to finish her master's degree. She married Stanley Early Jr., a fellow Army veteran, settled in Dayton, and raised 2 children. She worked in education, served on countless boards, spent her life opening doors and breaking barriers and smoothing the way for the next generation. But she never talked much about the war. Not for decades, because who would believe her? Who would believe that 855 black women had gone to Europe in 1945 and accomplished something the military said was impossible? Mary Ragland went home to North Carolina and got married and raised a family. Dorothy Johnson became a reading specialist, teaching at the same elementary school she'd attended as a child. Alice Dixon worked and lived and tried to forget the paper cuts and the cold and the mountains of undelivered mail that had nearly broken her, and America forgot them entirely. 3 of the women didn't make it home. Private Mary H. Bankston, Private Mary Jewel Barlow, and Private Dolores Mercedes Brown died in a Jeep accident in France. They were buried at Normandy American Cemetery. 3 of only 4 women laid to rest among more than 9,000 men who died in the invasion of Europe. Their headstones said United States Army, that was all. No mention of the 6,888th. No acknowledgement of what they'd done. The years passed, the decades passed. The women of the 6,888th grew old, and some of them died, and America still didn't remember. The history books talked about D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge, and the liberation of the concentration camps. They talked about the Tuskegee Airmen and the Navajo Code Talkers. They didn't talk about the only all-black, predominantly female battalion to serve overseas in World War II. They didn't talk about 855 women who'd faced down racism and sexism and the chaos of war and won. But the women remembered. In 1981, a few of them returned to England, where the mayor of Birmingham honored them for their service. In 1989, Charity Adams Early published her memoir, One Woman's Army. A black officer remembers the WAC, and finally someone was listening. In 2009, 3 surviving members of the 6,888th, the Dixon, Mary Ragland, and Gladys Shuster Carter, were honored at the Women in Military Service for America Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery. President Barack Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama met them, thanked them, told them that their service mattered. In 2019, the U.S. Army finally awarded the 6,888th a Meritorious Unit Commendation. 74 years late, but it came. In 2022, President Joe Biden signed legislation awarding the Congressional Gold Medal to the members of the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion. It's the highest civilian honor in the United States, reserved for those whose achievements have had lasting impact on American history. By 2024, only 4 members of the battalion were still alive: Romay Davis, Fannie McClendon, Lena King, and Anna Mae Robertson. They'd lived long enough to see their story finally told, to see monuments built in their honor, to see their names added to the history books. But most of their sisters were gone, died without ever receiving the recognition they deserved. And in 2025, as of this writing, only Fannie McClendon remains. The last living member of the 6,888, the last witness to what those women did in Birmingham and Rouen and Paris, the last person who can say, "I was there. I sorted the mail. I kept the soldiers connected to home. I helped win the war." When she's gone, there will be no one left who remembers what it felt like to stand in that freezing warehouse in February 1945, to look at the impossible task ahead, to hear Major Charity Adams say, "We're going to do it in 3 months," and to believe her. No one left who remembers the paper cuts and the eye strain and the rats and the cold. No one left who remembers the U-boats in the Atlantic and the V-1 rockets over Glasgow and the general who tried to send a white lieutenant to show them how to do their jobs. No one left who remembers proving everyone wrong, but the story remains. It lives in the letters the 6,888th delivered, in the soldiers who got mail from home when they needed it most, in the families who learned their sons were dead because a black woman in Birmingham took the time to stamp "deceased" on an envelope and send it back. It lives in every woman who joined the military after 1945, who rose through the ranks, who commanded units and led operations and refused to be told they couldn't do something because of their gender or their race. It lives in Fort Gregg Adams in Virginia, the first U.S. military base named after African Americans, including Lieutenant Colonel Charity Adams Early. The story lives because 855 women refused to let it die, because they went to war when their country didn't want them, did a job everyone said they'd fail at, and came home to silence and obscurity and kept going anyway, because they survived in a state of pleasant belligerency with no chips on their shoulders, just slightly below, because they understood what history keeps trying to forget, that the most important battles aren't always fought with rifles and tanks. Sometimes they're fought with envelopes and addresses and a card catalog system that tracks 7 million names. Sometimes they're fought by women who work 3 shifts in freezing warehouses and never get parades when they come home. Sometimes the heroes are forgotten, but that doesn't make them any less heroic. Major Charity Adams stood in the empty warehouse in Birmingham in May 1945 and looked at what her battalion had accomplished. 3 months to clear a 6-month backlog. 17 million pieces of mail sorted and delivered. 7 million soldiers connected to home. An impossible mission made possible by women who refused to fail. She thought about the general who tried to send a white officer to run her unit. She thought about the Red Cross facilities that had tried to segregate her soldiers. She thought about the U-boats and the buzz bombs and the endless bone-deep cold. She thought about the women who'd stood beside her, who'd worked until their fingers bled and their eyes burned, who'd proven that black women could do anything white men could do and do it better. And she thought about the future, about all the women who'd come after them, who'd serve in the military and never know how hard this had been, never know what battles had been fought just to get them here. Maybe that was okay. Maybe that was the point. To open doors and break barriers and smooth the way so that the next generation didn't have to fight the same battles. I have opened a few doors, broken a few barriers, she'd say later, looking back on her life, and I hope smoothed the way to some degree for the next generation. They all had. The women of the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion had fought their war with card catalogs and envelopes, with dignity and determination, with excellence that couldn't be ignored no matter how hard the world tried. They'd delivered more than mail. They'd delivered proof that the American military's racism and sexism were lies, that black women were soldiers, that they deserved respect and recognition and a place in history. It took 80 years for history to remember them, but it remembered. And now, standing in this empty warehouse with the blackout paint still on the windows and the concrete floor still freezing and the ghost of rat droppings still haunting the corners, Major Charity Adams allowed herself a moment of pride. Just one moment, because there was more work to do, always more work to do. But for one moment she stood in the silence and let herself feel it. They'd won. Not the war. The war would be won by men with rifles and tanks and bombs. But this battle, the battle to prove that black women belonged in uniform, that they could serve with honor, that they could accomplish the impossible, this battle was theirs. No male, low morale, that was their motto. They'd made sure the mail got through. And in doing so, they'd made sure their story would too. Eventually, slowly, 80 years too late, but still, the women of the 688 would be remembered, not as footnotes, not as afterthoughts, but as heroes, as soldiers, as the extraordinary women they were. The warehouse was empty, the work was done, and 855 women who'd been told they couldn't did. That was victory enough.